Hello everybody, welcome to Phantom Era, a channel where we talk about the weird and wacky to the educational and downright preposterous. Today we're going to be talking about something called Operation Sea Spray, which in theory sounds extremely innocent, but I can guarantee you that it is most definitely not. Operation Sea Spray is actually considered the Navy's largest experiment, and we'll get into why, but first I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of a background on what it is, what the goal was, and what was used during the experiment. So, Operation Sea Spray was designed to purposefully infect San Francisco with biological components to apparently determine how susceptible the city would be to an external bioweapon. Um, Ironically, in order to determine just how deadly such an event would be, the U.S. just released strains of Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigi across San Francisco. I may or may not have pronounced those correctly. I'm doing my best. I am not in the medical field. But at the time of releasing these bacteria, they were like, oh, don't worry about it, guys. The bacteria are completely harmless. And you may be wondering, how did they know this? They kind of didn't. Their assumption that it was harmless was based on the fact that during research and initially handling these bacteria, nobody had gotten sick and died. So they were like, oh, it must be completely fine. Nobody in the research lab has exploded or bled from their eyes, so we're gonna be just fine. Yeah, neither bacteria are completely harmless to humans. Serratia marcescens is a bacteria that can cause fever, frequent urination, and pain while urinating. And then Bacillus globigi is a leading cause in food poisoning, which if you've ever had food poisoning, it freaking sucks. But for those who don't know, food poisoning is usually severe vomiting, diarrhea, you get really dehydrated because of it. It's just all around not fun. Nobody really enjoys it. That's why it's called poisoning, it's ugh. Also, interestingly, Bacillus globigi can also cause some weird infections. Like you can get eye infections, you can get bacteremia, you can get sepsis, you can get ventriculitis, and you can even get peritonitis. I'm not sure what half of those are. I'll probably edit and post what exactly that means. But yeah, that's also something that can happen from this bacteria. But the reason that it's used so much is because it's considered a simulant for anthrax. Basically, they're so similar in what they can do, but one's gonna kill a bunch of people and one might just make some people violently ill. So they're like, oh, we'll go with the violently ill one because we don't want to murder a bunch of people with anthrax for a study. So during this time where a lot of these experiments were run, they used Bacillus globigi because it was not gonna commit mass murder. Still problematic though, in my opinion. Clearly, both of these bacteria were actually quite problematic and potentially harmful to humans, and it was particularly bad for a specific group of people. One, the immunocompromised. Those people, if you contract either of these bacteria, it could be completely deadly. You could just, yeah, you're gone, because you can't fight it the way that a normal person's immune system would. And then also, the bacteria are most commonly encountered after surgeries or medical procedures. So anybody that had really given birth, had a surgery, or had some sort of really bad wound at the time of this experiment was in a heap of trouble because they were being exposed to bacteria that could just slide on into their bloodstream and mess them up from the inside out. Like I said, while these bacteria are definitely dangerous, the military genuinely believed that no problems were going to come of this. And so, uh, September 20th was when they, in 1950, was originally when they started dosing San Francisco. They had two giant ships that were off the coast in the San Francisco Bay area with giant hoses just launching a crap ton of these bacteria. They spread it from September 20th to September 27th, so they'd been doing this, just pumping this stuff out for about a week. And they had 43 monitoring stations around the city, which I'm not really sure how this came about. I couldn't really find anything on it, but that's a lot, and I don't know how people didn't notice, but I guess they kept it on the down low or whatever. But eventually these 43 monitoring stations were like, you know what, guys? That's enough of the bacteria for the 800,000 people that live here. You don't have to spray anymore. Frankly, I think spraying an entire city for 7 days is kind of overkill, and I'll kind of get into reasons why later. This whole experiment doesn't make sense for the reason that they say it does. But apparently, with the amount that they of the bacteria that they sprayed, each citizen was going to inhale approximately 5,000 particles of the bacteria, which, in my opinion, is kind of a lot. So this level of particle exposure was considered ineffective in regard to anthrax, meaning that in the simulation, if the bacteria were instead anthrax, San Francisco would be relatively unaffected, except for, like people that are immunocompromised and things like that. It wasn't until October 11th that repercussions following the bacterial exposure really began to take shape. As mentioned earlier, Serratio marcescens can cause fever, frequent urination, and pain while urinating. And these are all symptoms and signs of like either kidney stones or urinary tract infections. And coincidentally, up to 11 San Francisco residents reported to have checked into Stanford Hospital having contracted rare and severe urinary tract infections. And urinary tract infections can be extremely problematic if they aren't treated properly or within a certain amount of time because it's an infection, so it'll just spread to the rest of your body, and that is bad. So it's amazing to me that only 11 people got impacted by this, but it is important to note that I believe it's documented that all 11 people who did contract these infections had had previous surgery. So, like I said, there's a bit of a correlation there, as I mentioned earlier, with the bacteria. 10 of the affected people ended up surviving, but there was a man named Edward J. Nevin who ultimately died about like 3 weeks later, I believe. And so this was due to the fact that a valve in his heart failed. And it's kind of difficult to say that the infection, like the urinary tract infection, was responsible for it, for like making his heart fail. There might be a correlation there. In like the simplest terms, correlation does not always equal causation. However, his family did go on to try and sue the U.S. Navy for the bacteria and for his death. Basically, the Navy laughed at them and was like, "It wasn't us. What are you talking about, bro? We didn't do anything. What? No, we weren't responsible for that." And they were like, well, you don't have any proof. Like, you can't definitively link that what we did is the reason that he died. And ultimately, Edward's family ended up losing the case, and they weren't given any sort of compensation, which kind of sucks, but, I mean, it is what it is, unfortunately. Back to the outbreak in and of itself of the urinary tract infections. It was so unusual that the hospital actually ended up reporting it and, like, putting it in a scientific journal because they were like, what the hell is happening? Like, this has never happened before. Like, 11 people with the same, like, strain of, like, urinary tract infection. Like, we never heard of this. Later, when all of this kind of came out, the Navy was like, oh, well, it was the hospital's fault. See, all of these people had surgery, so it was a hospital that all gave them the urinary tract infection. But by all accounts, the hospital never had that type of bacteria in it. So there was basically no way that any of the people that had surgeries there were going to get a urinary tract infection from the hospital itself. So it's definitely the Navy, as far as I'm concerned. Like, that just kind of, 1 + 1 = 2. The funny part to me, though, is this entire thing is just basically the Navy going, no, we didn't. We didn't do that, guys. What are you talking about? You don't have any proof. And there's 11 people that are, like, in the hospital for symptoms that are directly caused by bacteria that they have just been spraying all over San Francisco. Like, the whole idea of them just sitting there, like, denying it is just hilarious to me. It's like, oh, did you hit your little brother? Oh, no, Mom, I didn't. And there's a giant handprint on your little brother's back. What's also interesting is that the bacteria that causes the urinary tract infection, Serratio marcescens, is actually really prominent in, like, research studies because it can dye things red. Like, there's a red color to it, so it's easy to trace and things like that. And so all of the people that went into the hospital for their urinary tract infections had a red tint to their urine. Now, this can be because of blood, but when you're testing urine, you can determine what is blood, what isn't blood, what's a bacteria, what isn't a bacteria. Like, there's a whole system to it. I've had my pee tested quite a few times because I have kidney stones and it sucks. But yeah, so they were like, oh, this is really weird. Like, their urine's, like, dyed red and it's not blood. What could this be from? Like I said, Serratio marcescens is red. Like, it makes things red when it infects it, or like when the bacteria touches it. And again, the Navy's just like, no, that's not us. We didn't do that. We don't know how that got there, guys. Also, at this time, um, pneumonia cases in San Francisco like skyrocketed. A lot of people were having breathing problems, and these were like never as easily kind of like referenced as a correlation to the experiment, just because a lot of people didn't end up going to the hospital for it, and it wasn't as like out of the ordinary, I guess, as like having 11 people with the same urinary tract infection. But like I said, the Army, the Navy went on so far as to say that the illnesses in San Francisco were tied simply by coincidence to the experiment. That was like their big excuse for all of it, was just, oh well, it was a coincidence, like you can't directly prove that we were attacking you guys with a biological weapon. Which is hilarious to me, because when the report came out later, like, it's pretty obvious what they did. I think the report came out in like 1976, and the public was like, yo, what? Hey, no, wait on a second. Like, this makes so much more sense now. Due to the supposed success of this experiment, even more weapons testing took place. There were other studies performed with the US using like identical bacteria, and all through the next decade, until Richard Nixon banned testing in 1969, meaning that the US military had like secretly been dosing its citizens for nearly 2 decades with different strains of bacteria. And as horrific as that sounds, it actually gets worse, because at the time of the San Francisco experiment, Operation Sea Spray was considered the largest human experiment in history, and it was also completely violating the Nuremberg Code. Simply put, the Nuremberg Code states that voluntary informed consent is a must for anyone to participate in an experiment, and that any experiment which may cause death or disabling injury is absolutely unacceptable and not allowed at all. The Navy didn't give a crap about this, because despite the clear language of the code, up to 239 germ warfare experiments were performed, including experiments on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, the New York City subway, and even the National Airport. So they really just threw the code away, put it through a shredder, and they were like, you know what, we're illiterate. We can't read that. If we can't read it, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't hold any weight, right, guys? To me, what's so troubling about these secret experiments isn't even like the lack of consent and the secrecy surrounding it, but the potential long-lasting effects of what they did. So, in a few other health crises in the San Francisco Bay Area over the past couple of years, both forms of the bacteria sprayed during Operation Sea Spray were found, which indicates that when the large dosage was released over 7 days, it established a new foreign microbial colony for the bacteria. In plain terms, it's basically an invasive species. Like, essentially, both bacteria have taken root in an area that they weren't really in before, and then changed the microscopic warfare between bacteria there. Like, now there's new bacteria that's competing with other organisms, other bacteria, and the human body. And so, because of this, there are like long lasting effects, because theoretically that bacteria shouldn't be there, and yet it is. While the experiment did show that an area such as San Francisco would be relatively susceptible to biological warfare, I don't really think that the experiment was even necessary at all, because the whole point of biological warfare is that the denser a population is, the more effective the weapon becomes. Because a small dosage of any biological weapon is going to be more of an impact on, let's say, 50 people in a tiny room compared to one guy that's like sitting alone in a corner. It's not necessarily the size of the dosage that matters, it's the people that are in the area, like how dense the population is. So to me, it seems incredibly stupid that they're like, oh, we're gonna see how well a biological weapon would affect 800,000 people living in like a close knit city. Like, common sense tells you that a biological weapon would be pretty significant. Like, to me, I don't think that there was an experiment that was even needed. To me, it seems that when all of this came out, and when the military was forced to disclose their experiments and what they were doing, they were like, oh crap, what excuse can we come up with that would seem somewhat viable for a reason as to why we did this? And they were like, defense purposes. We did it. We did it for defense purposes, guys. We were just testing it on you to see that if somebody else did it, whether or not it would work. Which, first of all, doesn't make it okay at all in the first place. Like, to me, that's still really stupid, and it's kind of hilarious that they are trying to, like, backtrack as much as they are. But as far as I'm concerned, it seems to me like they wanted to test this on the American people because we wouldn't know, and then they could backpedal, and we'd be kind of like, well, that was kind of, like, messed up, but, okay, there's not much we can do about it. And then based on the data they collected, they can now use that to impact other people. You know, to me, any weapon is offensive first and foremost. Like when you think about the arms races, every weapon was meant to attack. And even if you're using a weapon defensively, it's still offensive because you're still attacking somebody else. So there's no like true defensive weapon. So to me, it just seems like they were developing this to see whether or not it would be viable and worth it to produce, a similar result on like another country if it were necessary. So I have a hard time swallowing the fact that it was for defensive research. Like to me, it genuinely wasn't. There's legitimately no way that you can justify it as defensive research. Like it's absolutely appalling to think that anyone would believe that in the first place. But then again, some people do, and it's so strange to me that these are people that are like, oh, we're here to protect and serve, and then they just went and dosed a bunch of innocent, unsuspecting American people with bacteria that may have killed the guy and definitely impacted other people. Overall, very fishy, very shady. Thankfully, like I said, we don't really have to worry about this too much that we know of because germ warfare like this was banned in the United States. So at least we have that going for us. But yeah, pretty shady business. That's basically all I gotta say on the matter. The fact that this happened, like I said, is like completely appalling to me. I still have a hard time wrapping my head around this, how anybody could justify it, but here we are. I also kind of went down a rabbit hole as far as like secret projects and operations and everything like that. So there will also be another video out this week that is on another super secret operation. Actually, it wasn't super secret. It was very much disclosed to the public. But that one is actually very interesting because it's like the most humane human experiment that I have probably ever heard of in my entire life. So stay tuned for that one. And in case you want to be there first and foremost when that video pops up, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so that you get notified when a new video drops. Thank you guys so much for watching as always. You're all fantastic. Stay safe out there. And always be a little bit skeptical, Who knows? There might be more Operation Sea Sprays happening in the wings. But I'll see all of you guys in the next video, and thank you so much for watching.